The ship landed on Kepler 442b on a Tuesday morning. Though nobody on board knew what day it really was anymore, after 6 months in space there, Yuki Tanaka stepped out first. Her boots sinking into the ash-colored soil of this strange new world that humanity had only dreamed about until now. The planet was beautiful in a terrifying way, with mountains that glowed red at their peaks, and forests of trees that seemed to be made of crystal and stone rather than wood and leaves. But Yuki had not come here for the scenery. She had come because of the readings, the heat signatures, the massive life forms that the satellites had detected moving through the valleys below. Every spacefaring species in the galaxy had warned humanity about this place, the Galactic Concord. That ancient alliance of alien civilizations had classified the creatures here as level 9 hazardous species, which meant they were considered too dangerous to approach, too deadly to study, too wild to ever be anything but a threat. They called them Drakonitsuki, called them beautiful. She had spent her entire career studying creatures that others feared, and she had learned one truth that most scientists ignored. Fear was usually just ignorance wearing a mask. The first Draconid she saw was massive, at least 40 feet from nose to tail, with scales that shifted between red and gold. As the light hit them, its wings were folded against its back, and smoke curled from its nostrils with every breath. It was watching her. Yuki did not run. She did not reach for a weapon or call for backup or retreat to the safety of the ship. Instead, she sat down on a rock about 100 meters from the creature and opened her pack. She had brought food, simple protein bars that the ship's kitchen had prepared, and she laid them out on the ground in front of her. Then she waited. The Draconid did not move, neither did Yuki. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange that reminded her of home. The creature watched her the entire time, its golden eyes never blinking, never looking away when darkness fell. Yuki returned to the ship the next morning. She went back to the same spot. The Draconid was still there, and so were the protein bars. Untouched, Yuki sat down again and waited. This became her routine for the next 47 days. Her crew thought she had lost her mind, and the captain of the ship, a gruff man named Rodriguez, threatened to leave her behind if she did not show some results soon. But Yuki knew what she was doing. She was not trying to study the Draconid or capture it or prove anything to anyone. She was simply trying to show it that she meant no harm. In the 48th day, everything changed. Yuki had just settled onto her usual rock when she heard movement behind her. She turned slowly, carefully, and found herself face to face with a different Draconid, smaller than the first one, but still enormous, with scales of deep blue and eyes like molten silver. It was a female, Yuki realized, and she was old, very old, with scars across her snout and wings that told stories of battles fought long ago. The creature lowered her head until her snout was just inches from Yuki's face. Yuki could feel the heat radiating from within, could smell sulfur and something else, something almost sweet, like burning honey. She did not move. The Draconid exhaled, a warm breath that washed over Yuki like a wave. And then she did something that no one in the galaxy would have believed possible. She sat down right there, next to Yuki, like a dog settling beside its owner, like a friend taking a seat next to another friend. Yuki's hands were shaking as she reached into her pack and pulled out a protein bar. She held it out, offering it the way you might offer a treat to a nervous animal. The Draconid sniffed it once, twice, and then her long tongue darted out and snatched it from Yuki's palm. She swallowed it whole and made a sound that Yuki would later describe as a purr, though it was more like the rumble of distant thunder. Yuki named her Ember. Over the following weeks, Yuki learned more about the Draconids than any scientist in galactic history. She learned that they were not mindless beasts, but intelligent creatures with their own language, their own social structures, their own emotions. Ember was the matriarch of her clan, The leader of a family that spanned 3 generations, she had lost mates and children to hunters from other worlds. Aliens who had come seeking trophies or trying to capture specimens for study. She had every reason to hate the creatures that fell from the sky. But she had watched Yuki for those 47 days. And she had seen something different. She had seen patience and kindness and respect. Things that no other species had ever shown her. When Yuki finally returned to Earth, she did not come alone. Ember came with her, along with 3 eggs that the matriarch had entrusted to Yuki's care. The scientific community was shocked, and the military was alarmed. And the government did not know what to do with this woman who had somehow befriended the most dangerous creatures in the known universe. But Yuki did not care about any of that. She cared about the eggs, which she kept warm in a special incubator she had built herself. She cared about Ember, who had left her homeworld to follow a strange small creature to an unknown planet because she had decided, against all logic, to trust her. The first egg hatched on a rainy night in April. Yuki was not there to see it because she was at a conference, giving a presentation about her findings to a room full of skeptics who did not believe a word she said. But someone else was there, a little girl named Mira, just 7 years old. The daughter of one of Yuki's lab assistants. Myra had snuck into the incubation room because she wanted to see the eggs. And she was there when the first one cracked open and a tiny head emerged, covered in damp scales that gleamed like silver in the dim light. Hatchling looked at her with eyes that were too intelligent for something so small. Myra looked back. Something passed between them in that moment. Something that neither of them could explain. Something that felt like recognition, like coming home. Like finding a piece of yourself that you never knew was missing. When Yuki returned the next morning, she found Myra asleep on the floor with the hatchling curled up in her arms. The little girl had named him Ash. That was how it began over the next decade. More humans bonded with more draconids, and scientists discovered that the connection was not just emotional but neurological. A low-level psychic link that grew stronger over time. Bonded pairs could sense each other's emotions, anticipate each other's movements, fight together like a single being with 2 bodies. The Galactic Concord watched from a distance. Horrified and fascinated in equal measure, humanity had done the impossible. They had not conquered the draconids or tamed them or broken their spirits. They had simply asked them to be friends, and the dragons, who had been alone and feared for 10,000 years, had said yes. 40 years had passed since Yuki Tanaka first sat down on that rock and waited for a dragon to notice her. The world had changed in ways that nobody could have predicted. Human cities now had landing pads on their rooftops, not for helicopters or flying cars, but for draconids who needed a place to rest their wings after a long flight. Children grew up watching bonded pairs walk down the street, a human and a dragon side by side. As normal as a person walking their dog. Fire stations had changed. The most traditional firefighters still existed, but now they worked alongside draconids whose scales could withstand temperatures that would melt steel. A dragon could fly into a burning building and locate survivors by their heat signatures, could create controlled burns to stop wildfires from spreading, could carry people to safety on their backs while flames roared all around them. Search and rescue teams deployed with draconids who could cover miles of wilderness in minutes, who could see in the dark, who could smell a lost hiker from half a mountain away. The military had bonded pairs too, though they were used more for defense than attack. Massive dragons who served as living shields for the soldiers they loved. But most draconids were simply family. They lived in backyards that had been converted into dragon-sized dens, ate meals with their humans, played with children who had grown up thinking that having a fire-breathing companion was the most normal thing in the world. Myra was 37 now, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face lined with the kind of wrinkles that came from smiling too much. Ash had grown into a magnificent creature, His silver scales now shot through with veins of gold. His wingspan wide enough to block out the sun when he flew overhead. They had been together for 30 years. And their bond had only grown stronger with time. Myra could feel Ash's emotions as clearly as her own. Could sense when he was hungry or tired or excited or sad. When she dreamed, she sometimes saw through his eyes. Soaring over mountains and oceans that she had never visited in her waking life. The scientists called it neural synchronization, a fancy term for something that felt much simpler than that Ash was part of her. And she was part of him. They were one being in two bodies. And nothing would ever change. That Ambassador Chen Wei understood this better than most. He was 62 years old. A career diplomat who had spent his life negotiating treaties and smoothing over conflicts between nations. His companion was named Sovereign, a scarred elder draconid who had been with him since he was a young man fresh out of university. Sovereign had lost an eye in a fight with poachers decades ago, and her left wing was torn in 3 places, making her flight uneven and slow, but she was still the most terrifying thing most people had ever seen. A creature of fire and fury who could reduce a building to ash with a single breath. Chen Wei loved her more than he had ever loved anything when the Galactic Concord finally agreed to meet with humanity. It was Chen Wei who was chosen to represent Earth. He arrived at Nexus Prime, the massive space station that served as the capital of galactic civilization. Aboard a ship that had been specially modified to accommodate Sovereign, the station was enormous. A sprawling city in space that housed millions of beings from hundreds of different species. Chen Wei had studied the alien races that made up the Concord, had memorized their customs, and their languages and their histories, knew that the insectoid Veth were traitors and slavers, who valued profit above all else. He knew that the reptilian Cassari were ancient and proud, and deeply suspicious of any species that challenged their dominance. He knew that the gas-dwelling ephemerae communicated through patterns of light and rarely involved themselves in the affairs of solid beings. Knew that the amphibious nereids were philosophers and poets who bonded with creatures of the deep sea on their home world. He knew that the tree-like Verdani were the oldest species in the Concord, living for thousands of years and moving so slowly that most other races forgot they were even alive. But knowing about them was different from standing before them. The council chamber was circular, with seats arranged in tiers that rose toward a domed ceiling painted with the stars of 1,000. Different homeworlds representatives from every member species sat in their designated places, watching as Chen Wei walked to the center of the room. Sovereign walked beside him, her claws clicking against the metal floor, her single eye scanning the crowd for threats. The reaction was immediate. The Veth clicked their mandibles and pressed themselves back against their seats, their compound eyes wide with fear. The ephemerae dimmed until they were barely visible, withdrawing into themselves the way prey animals did when a predator appeared. The Cassari hissed, their scales rippling with colors that Chen Wei recognized as alarm and anger. Even the ancient Verdani seemed to tremble, their leaves rustling despite the still air. Only the nereids remained calm, their large dark eyes watching Sovereign with something that looked almost like respect. Counselor Rex of the Cassari rose from his seat, his voice sharp with accusation. "You bring weapons to a diplomatic summit," he demanded, pointing one clawed finger at Sovereign. Chen Wei smiled, the same calm diplomatic smile he had used in 1,000 negotiations. "I brought my friend," he said. The chamber erupted in chaos, voices overlapping as species argued and shouted and demanded explanations. Chen Wei waited for the noise to die down before he spoke again. Explained everything. The history of human draconid bonds, the science behind neural synchronization, the ways that dragons and humans had learned to live together as partners rather than master and servant. Spoke of Yuki Tanaka and her 47 days of waiting, of Myra and Ash, and the moment of recognition that had changed everything. Of the firefighters and rescue workers and families who had discovered that the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy just wanted to be loved. Some of the counselors listened with interest, others with skepticism, and a few with barely concealed hostility. Counselor Rex looked like he wanted to order an immediate attack. But before anyone could respond to Chen Wei's presentation, something happened that would become legend throughout the galaxy. A shot rang out. Chen Wei felt the bullet before he heard it, felt the displacement of air as it passed within inches of his head, felt Sovereign's rage explode through their bond like a supernova. The pot Sovereign's rage explode through their bond like a supernova. Dragon moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move, her body twisting to place itself between Chen Wei and the source of the attack. A second shot hit her in the shoulder, and she roared with pain but did not fall. Instead, she opened her mouth and released a blast of fire that melted a section of the chamber wall into glowing slag. She could have killed everyone in the room. She could have burned the entire station to cinders, but she did not. The fire was a warning, nothing more. A demonstration of what she was capable of and what she chose not to do. Security forces swarmed the chamber, and within minutes they had apprehended the shooter, a young Veth who had been hired by someone to eliminate the human ambassador before humanity could be admitted to the Concord. Chen Wei stood in the center of the chaos, one hand resting on Sovereign's neck, feeling her heartbeat slow as her rage subsided. The other counselors stared at them both with new eyes. They had seen a dragon protect her human with her own body, had seen her choose restraint when violence would have been so easy, had seen the bond between them in action. This is what we offered the galaxy, Chen Wei said into the silence that followed. Not weapons, not threats, but partnership. The kind of partnership that makes you willing to die for someone else. The kind that makes you strong enough to choose mercy when you could choose destruction. He looked around the chamber at the faces, watching him, alien and strange and frightened and curious. We are not asking you to trust us, he said. We are asking you to give us a chance to earn that trust. The vote on humanity's admission would not happen that day. But something had shifted in the chamber. Something that could not be unseen or unfelt. The galaxy had witnessed what a bonded pair could do. They were only beginning to understand what it meant. The Veth had always been slavers. It was written into their history and their culture and their very biology. A species of insectoids who viewed all other life forms as either useful or worthless. They had built their empire on the backs of captured workers, had grown rich selling living beings to the highest bidder, had perfected the art of breaking spirits and crushing hope. The Galactic Concord tolerated them because they were powerful and because they controlled the trade routes that connected the outer systems to the core worlds. Nobody liked the Veth, but everybody needed them. Commander Vrethka was a typical example of his species. Ruthless and calculating, and utterly without mercy, he had risen through the ranks of the Veth military by being smarter and crueler than everyone around him. And now he commanded a fleet of 40 warships that patrolled the borders of Veth space when the human colony ship Wandering Star strayed into disputed territory. Vrethka saw an opportunity that was too good to pass up. Humans were soft. Everyone knew that they were sentimental and emotional and easily manipulated, and these humans had something that made them even more valuable than usual. They had dragons. The Wandering Star was carrying 300 colonists as their way to establish a new settlement in the outer systems. 46 of those colonists were bonded pairs, humans and draconids who had signed up for the dangerous mission because they wanted to build something new together. When Vrethka's fleet surrounded them, the captain of the Wandering Star surrendered without a fight. There was no point in resisting. Not against 40 warships, not with civilians on board. Not when the only alternative was death. Vrethka boarded the human ship himself. his compound eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he surveyed his prizes. The humans were frightened but defiant. Standing close to their dragon companions and refusing to show weakness, the Draconids were magnificent, dozens of them in all sizes and colors. Their scales catching the light as they growled warnings at the Veth soldiers who surrounded them. Separate them. Rethka ordered his soldiers move forward with shock prods and restraining nets. And chaos-erupted dragons roared and snapped and breathed fire. And humans screamed and fought with bare hands against armored aliens twice their size. In the end, it did not matter. The Veth had done this before. Had broken wild Draconids in the early days before the Concord banned contact with the species. They knew exactly how much sedative was needed to bring down a dragon. Exactly where to place the restraints. Exactly how to cage a creature that was born to fly within hours. All 46 Draconids were unconscious in specially designed containment cells deep in the hold of Rethka's flagship. The humans were locked in a separate section of the ship, stripped of their belongings and packed into cells that were barely big enough to stand. Rethka watched the security feeds with satisfaction. Dragons would be sold to the highest bidder, probably to one of the rim worlds that did not follow Concord regulations. The humans would fetch a good price too, especially the bonded ones who knew how to care for Draconids. It was a perfect operation. Clean and efficient and profitable. Then the first dragon woke up. His name was Thunder, and he was bonded to a man named Marcus Cole, who had been a structural engineer before he volunteered for the colony mission. Thunder was young by Draconid standards, only 20 years old, with scales of deep purple that turned almost black when he was angry. Right now, his scales were the color of midnight. The sedative should have kept him unconscious for at least 12 more hours. But the Veth had not accounted for the bond. Marcus was awake and afraid, and his fear was screaming through the neural link that connected him to Thunder. A constant pulse of panic that cut through the fog of drugs like a knife through paper. Thunder opened his eyes. He was in a cage made of some kind of metal that he did not recognize, surrounded by other cages containing other dragons who were still asleep. He could feel Marcus somewhere above him, could feel his human's terror and desperation and love, and he could feel something else too, something that he had never felt before. Every bonded Draconid within range could feel it. Thunder was not just waking up. He was calling the psychic scream that erupted from Thunder's mind was not something that could be heard with ears. It was something deeper than sound, a primal howl of rage and pain that rippled through the neural network that connected all bonded Paris and Earth. Ash lifted his head from his den and roared in response, his eyes blazing with reflected fire on Nexus Prime. Sovereign's single eye snapped open, and she lunged toward the window of the diplomatic quarters where she and Chen Wei were staying across the galaxy. Hundreds of Draconids felt the call and answered it, a chorus of fury that shook the very fabric of space. The human military responded faster than anyone expected. Within 6 hours of receiving the distress signal that Thunder's call had somehow broadcast across light years of void, a fleet of 200 warships was racing toward Veth space. They were not alone. 300 Draconids flew alongside them, some in the specially designed launch bays of the larger ships, others riding on the outer hulls with their claws dug into the metal and their wings folded tight against the vacuum. This was not supposed to be possible. Dragons could not survive in space, could not fly without air, could not withstand the cold and the radiation and the emptiness. But these dragons were bonded, and their humans were calling to them just as surely as Thunder had called to the rest of his kind. The bond gave them strength that defied physics, that laughed at the laws of nature, that made the impossible nothing more than an inconvenience. Rethke received word of the approaching fleet. Just as his ships were preparing to jump to hyperspace, he could not believe the reports at first, could not accept that humanity had mobilized so quickly, or that they were bringing dragons with them. but the evidence was undeniable. Hundreds of contacts on the sensors. Closing fast with every passing minute, he could have run. He could have jumped to hyperspace and escaped before the humans arrived. But Vrethka was Veth, and the Veth did not run from soft, sentimental creatures who let their emotions make them weak. He ordered his fleet to battle stations and prepared to show the galaxy what happened to species that challenged the Veth. Dominion, the battle was over in less than an enlay. Our human ships were faster and better armed than Vrethka had expected. But that was not what decided the fight. What decided the fight was the dragons. They came down on the Veth fleet like meteors, their scales glowing with re-entry heat, their mouths opening to release streams of fire that burned hot enough to melt through hull plating. They moved in perfect coordination with the human pilots, dodging weapons fire that should have been impossible to avoid, targeting critical systems with impossible precision. The bond made them more than individuals. It made them an army that shared a single mind. Vrethka's flagship was the last to fall. Marcus Cole led the assault personally, flying on Thunder's back with nothing but a spacesuit between him and the void. They burned through the hull and fought their way through corridors filled with panicking Veth soldiers until they reached the command deck. Vrethka died with a look of disbelief on his face, unable to comprehend how his perfect operation had fallen apart so completely. The cages were opened, and the sedated dragons were revived, and the captured humans were freed. Marcus found Thunder in the chaos of the rescue, limping through destroyed corridors with blood on his face and tears in his eyes. Thunder was wounded too, burns on his flanks from weapons fire, a gash across his chest from a Veth soldier's blade. But he was alive. They were both alive. Marcus collapsed against his dragon side, and Thunder curled around him, and they stayed like that for a long time, feeling each other's heartbeats through the bond, knowing that they would never be separated again. The galaxy watched the aftermath with a mixture of awe and terror. Humanity had just destroyed a Veth fleet in less than an hour, had demonstrated military capabilities that nobody had suspected they possessed, had shown that threatening a bonded pair was the same as declaring war on all of them. The Veth Dominion collapsed within months, its slave markets empty, its trade routes abandoned, its power broken beyond repair. Other slaver nations quietly released their human captives and pretended they had never considered such a thing in the first place. The message was clear: hurt a human, face their dragon. Hurt a dragon, face their human. Either way, you face both. And nobody who faced both ever walked away. The fall of the Veth Dominion sent shockwaves through galactic civilization for centuries. The Veth had been a power that other species feared and respected, a constant presence in the dark corners of the galaxy where laws meant nothing and strength was the only currency that mattered. Now they were gone, shattered by a species that most of the Concord had dismissed as soft and weak and unworthy of attention. Humanity had changed the rules of the game, and not everyone was happy about it. Council of Rex of the Cassery had been one of the loudest voices calling for humanity to be rejected from the Concord, and the destruction of the Veth fleet had only made him more determined. He spent months building a coalition in the shadows, reaching out to species who shared his fears, whispering about the threat that humanity posed to the established order. They called themselves the Preservation Alliance, a collection of governments and factions that believed humanity needed to be stopped before it was too late. The Cassery were the backbone of the alliance, ancient reptilians who had been the dominant power in the galaxy before the Concord was formed. They remembered a time when they had ruled through fear, when their fleets had burned worlds and their soldiers had conquered systems. They saw in humanity a reflection of their own past, and they were terrified of what that might mean for their future. The remnants of the Veth joined the alliance too, seeking revenge for their fallen empire. So did a dozen minor species who had always lived in the shadow of larger powers and who saw the rise of humanity as a threat to whatever small influence they had managed to carve out for themselves. The debate in the Concord Council chamber lasted for weeks, every day. Representatives from different species rose to speak for or against humanity's admission, arguing about law and precedent and the fundamental question of whether a species that had weaponized level 9 creatures could ever be trusted. Council of Rex made his case with cold precision. Humanity has done what no other species in galactic history has managed to do, he said, his scales rippling with colors that indicated absolute certainty. They have taken the most dangerous creatures in the known universe and turned them into weapons. Pets that breathe fire at their command. Monsters that they have somehow convinced to fight and die for them. He pointed at the human delegation, where Chen Wei sat with Sovereign at his side. This is not partnership. Rex declared, this is slavery by another name, and if we allow them into the Concord, we are inviting a predator into our home. The human response was measured, and careful. Ambassador Chen Wei spoke of history and science and the true nature of the bond, explaining for the 100th time that draconids were not slaves but partners, not weapons but friends. He showed recordings of dragons playing with children, of search and rescue teams saving lives, of bonded pairs growing old together in peace. But the Alliance had their own recordings. Images of the battle against the Veth, of dragons burning through ships with fire that melted steel, of the devastation that bonded pairs could unleash when they were pushed too far. The vote was too close to call species that had been friendly to humanity wavered under pressure from the Alliance, and species that had been neutral began to wonder if Rex might be right after all. Even the Nereids, who had been humanity's strongest supporters, seemed uncertain about which way they would vote. Then Sovereign did something unprecedented. Ancient Dragon rose from her position beside Chen Wei and walked to the center of the chamber, her claws clicking against the floor, her single eye sweeping across the assembled representatives. Every species fell silent. Nobody had ever seen a draconid address the Concord before, and for a long moment, it seemed impossible that such a thing could even happen. Sovereign opened her mouth, and a voice emerged, translated through a device that Chen Wei had attached to her throat. I was born 10,000 years ago, in a cave on a world that your species had not yet learned to fear. Her voice was deep and resonant, filling the chamber with sound that seemed to vibrate in the bones of everyone who heard it. For most of my life, I was alone, as all draconids were alone. Creatures too powerful to befriend and too proud to submit. She turned slowly, looking at each section of the chamber in turn. Other species came to our world sometimes. Hunters seeking trophies, scientists seeking specimens, soldiers seeking weapons. And we killed them all, because that was the only response we knew. Sovereign's gaze settled on Council of Rex. You fear us. And I understand that fear, because I remember what we were before humans came. Apex predators who trusted nothing and no one, who lived and died alone because we had never known any other way. She turned back to the center of the chamber. Then Yuki Tanaka sat down on a rock and waited for 47 days, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply showing us that not everyone who came from the sky wanted to hurt us. A sound escaped from Sovereign's throat, something between a growl and a sigh. I was old when I met my human, old and tired and ready to die because there was nothing left for me to live for. And he showed me that I was wrong. She looked at Chen Wei, and something passed between them that needed no translation. He gave me a reason to continue, a purpose beyond survival, a connection that I had never imagined possible. Sovereign faced the council again. You ask if we are slaves, if we are weapons, if we are monsters that humanity has somehow tricked into serving them. Her voice rose, filling the chamber with sound that shook the walls. We are none of those things. We are family. We are partners. We are friends. Silence that followed was absolute. Then, Nereid. Representative rose from her seat, her large, dark eyes bright with emotion. The Nereids know something of bonds, she said. We have swum with the great whales of our home world for generations, sharing thoughts and dreams and lives with creatures that others might call beasts. She looked at Sovereign with respect that bordered on reverence. I vote yes on humanity's admission to the Concord. One by one, other species followed. The Verdani shifted in their ancient seats, their leaves rustling as they signaled agreement. The ephemeræ brightened until they blazed like small suns, their patterns of light spelling out words of welcome. Even some species that had seemed aligned with the alliance changed their votes, moved by Sovereign's words or simply unwilling to stand against the tide. When the final count was taken, humanity had won by a margin of 12 votes. The Preservation Alliance had failed. Council of Rex accepted the defeat with cold dignity. But his eyes never left Sovereign as he returned to his seat. This was not over. His gaze seemed to say, this was only the beginning. After the session ended, a young Nereid diplomat approached the human delegation. She was small for her species, with scales that shimmered between blue and green, and she looked nervous as she stopped in front of Myra, who had traveled to Nexus Prime to witness the historic vote. May I ask you something? The Nereid said, her voice soft and curious. Myra smiled and nodded, one hand resting on Ash's neck. The silver and gold dragon watched the alien with calm interest. How did you do it? The Nereid asked. How did you convince creatures like that to trust you? Myra considered the question. For a long moment, we did not tame them, she said. Finally, we did not conquer them or trick them or break their spirits until they had no choice but to obey. She looked up at Ash, and the dragon looked back, and their bond hummed between them like a song that only they could hear. We just listened, Myra said. We paid attention to what they needed, what they feared, and what they wanted. And then we tried to give them those things, not because we expected anything in return, but because that is what you do for someone you care about. She turned back to the Nereid. That is the secret, I suppose. If you want to call it a secret, we treated them like people instead of monsters, and they decided to treat us the same way. The Nereid was silent for a long time, processing this answer. Then she bowed, a gesture of deep respect in her culture, and walked away without another word. Myra watched her go and wondered what kind of galaxy they were building. Humans and dragons and all the other species who might learn from their example was a good question. She hoped they would have time to find out. The Preservation Alliance had been quiet for nearly 20 years. So quiet that many people had begun to believe they no longer existed. They were wrong. Council of Rex had spent 2 decades preparing for this moment, building weapons in secret shipyards, recruiting soldiers from species that still feared what humanity might become, studying the bond between humans and draconids with a single obsessive goal in mind, and found a way to break it. The device was called the Severance Array, a massive installation hidden in the asteroid belt of a dead system on the edge of known space. It generated a specific frequency of psychic interference that disrupted the neural link between bonded pairs, tearing apart the connection that made humans and dragons so dangerous. Rex had tested it on captured pairs, watching as dragons went mad with grief and humans collapsed into catatonic states. The results were everything he had hoped. Fourth attack came without warning. On a day that should have been a celebration, humanity had been a full member of the Galactic Concord for 19 years, and representatives from dozens of species had gathered on Nexus Prime to commemorate the anniversary. Shen Wei was there, old now, but still sharp, with Sovereign beside him as always. Myra's granddaughter Leon had come too, bonded to Ash's daughter Storm, continuing a family tradition that spanned 3 generations. And Marcus Cole was there with Thunder, both of them scarred from decades of service, but still as close as they had been on that Terrible day when the Veth had tried to tear them apart, the first wave of alliance. Ships came out of hyperspace directly on top of the station, their weapons already firing before anyone could react at the same moment. The Severance Array activated. The effect was instantaneous and devastating across the galaxy. Bonded pairs felt their connections shatter like glass. The psychic links that had sustained them for years suddenly gone, replaced by a void that felt worse than Death Dragons screamed. Their minds overwhelmed by the sudden absence of their humans collapsed. Their consciousness unable to cope with the loss of their other halves on Nexus Prime. The chaos was absolute. Dragons rampaged through the station, their fire burning out of control as they searched desperately for bonds that no longer existed. Humans lay on the floor, weeping or catatonic or simply staring at nothing. The Alliance forces moved through the devastation with ruthless efficiency, killing everyone they encountered. Human and dragon and innocent bystander alike. Rex watched from the bridge of his flagship, his scales shifting through colors of triumph and satisfaction. This is what happens when you challenge the natural order, he said to no one in particular. This is what happens when you try to tame what should remain wild. But he had miscalculated. Not all bonds broke. The oldest pairs, the ones who had been together for decades, found that their connections were stronger than the Severance Array could handle. The bond between Marcus and Thunder had been forged in the fire of their captivity and tempered by 20 years of shared experiences. And it did not shatter, it only dimmed, like a light seen through fog rather than darkness. The bond between Leanne and Storm was built on top of the bond between Myra and Ash. Generations of connection layered on top of each other until it was less a link and more a fusion of souls. And the bond between Chen Wei's daughter Mei and Sovereign was something that defied all scientific explanation. A 90-year-old dragon and a human woman who had grown up hearing stories what partnership truly meant. These pairs felt the attack, felt the pain of the array trying to tear them apart. And they refused. They gathered themselves in the chaos, reaching out through their dim bonds to find each other, to organize, to fight back. And they were not alone. Unbonded draconids still existed. Dragons who had chosen to live alongside humans without the neural link, who valued the friendship even without the psychic connection. These dragons had not been affected by the array, and they rose now to defend the species that had shown them kindness. Allied species joined the fight too. Nereids came with their whale ships, massive living vessels that moved through space like leviathans through water. The Verdani came with their forest fleets, ships grown from living wood that healed themselves as fast as they were damaged. Even some of the species that had joined Alliance defected when they saw what Rex was willing to do. Horrified by the slaughter of innocents that his victory required, the final battle took place in the space above Nexus Prime. Hundreds of ships clashed in a storm of weapons fire and dragon flame. And at the center of it all was Commander Mei Chun, riding on Sovereign's back as they had done 1,000 times before. Of Rex's flagship was massive, bristling with weapons, protected by the strongest shields that Alliance technology could produce. Mei did not care. She flew straight at it, and Sovereign followed. And together they burned a path through the Alliance fleet that left nothing but ash and wreckage behind. Then Rex saw them coming and opened a channel, his voice cutting through the static of battle. "How?" he demanded, his composure finally cracking. "The bond is broken. I broke it myself." "How are you still fighting?" Mei's response was calm, almost pitying. "You thought the bond was a leash," she said. "You thought it was something we used to control them, to force them to do our bidding." Sovereign roared, and the sound carried across the void. "Impossible but undeniable. It was never a leash," Mei continued. "It was a choice. Their choice and our choice, made freely every single day." She looked down at the dragon beneath her, felt the dim pulse of their connection, and knew that it would grow strong again when the array was destroyed. "We choose each other," she said, again and again. "No matter what anyone does to try to stop us, forever." Sovereign's fire burned through the flagship's shields like they were made of paper, and Vrex's last scream was lost in the roar of dragon flames. Alliance fell. The Severance array was destroyed, and the broken bonds began to heal. Slowly and painfully, but inevitably, the Concord was reformed with humanity and their dragon partners as founding members. And new laws were written to protect bonded pairs from ever facing such an attack again. But the most important change was not political or legal, it was cultural across the galaxy. Other species began to look at the creatures they had feared or ignored or exploited with new eyes. The Kasari, humbled by the defeat of the alliance they had helped create, made contact with a species of mountain-dwelling predators on their home world. Creatures they had hunted for sport for generations. The Nereids deepened their bond with the great whales, developing a connection that began to approach what humans shared with draconids and the ephemerae, who had always been the most alien and isolated of the Concord species. Reached out to the plasma beings who lived in the hearts of stars, finding common ground with creatures that seemed to have nothing in common with them at Allah. 100 years after Yuki Tanaka sat down on that rock and waited, a young Kasari child walked through the wilderness of her homeworld and found a wounded creature in a ravine. Was one of the mountain predators, a juvenile with a broken wing and eyes that blazed with pain and fear. Everyone in the child's village would have told her to run, to call the hunters, to stay away from the dangerous beast before it hurt her. Instead, she climbed down into the ravine. She sat a safe distance from the creature and opened her pack. She had food inside, simple rations that she had brought for her hike, and she laid them out on the ground. Then she waited. The predator watched her with those blazing eyes, growling softly, unsure what to make of this small being who did not run or attack or show any sign of fear. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. The child did not move. Finally, as the shadows grew long and the air grew cold, the predator stopped growling. It lowered its head, looked at the food, and then at the child. Something passed between them in that moment. Something that the child could not explain, but that she recognized from the stories she had heard about. Humans and dragons. It felt like recognition. It felt like coming home. It felt like the beginning of something new somewhere, across the vastness of space and time. Yuki Tanaka would have smiled. The galaxy had learned the lesson that humanity had tried to teach it all along. The most powerful force in the universe was not fire or weapons or fear. It was simply the willingness to reach out to something different and ask in whatever way you could, "Would you like to be friends?" And sometimes, against all odds and expectations, the answer was yes.